On Father's Day, my daughter sent me a wooden box. When my wife Catherine saw it, she went pale and begged me not to open it. "Can't you see what this is?" she said, backing away like it might explode. I looked closer and froze. Inside that wooden box was something. I made a call. 5 minutes later, police arrived. Now, before I share what happened next, if this story speaks to you in any way, I'd be grateful if you'd consider giving it a thumbs up. Father's Day morning came with the kind of silence that settles into a house like dust. No card slipped under my door, no smell of Catherine making her famous blueberry pancakes that she used to insist were just for Dad. I sat at the kitchen table, the same oak table I'd refinished 30 years ago when we first moved in, running my fingers along the grain patterns I knew by heart. The coffee tasted bitter, or maybe that was just me. If you're watching this from somewhere that still celebrates fathers the old-fashioned way, consider yourself lucky. I'd appreciate it if you could take a moment to like this video if it speaks to you, and perhaps share where you're joining me from today. It helps more people find these stories. And honestly, at my age, knowing people are listening means more than you might think. The doorbell rang around 10 that morning, sharp and sudden in the quiet house. Catherine was upstairs, probably on one of her long phone calls with her sister in Oregon, the ones where she'd lower her voice whenever I walked past. The delivery driver stood there with a wooden box, about the size of a shoebox, no shipping label, just my name carved into the top in careful script. "Sign here," he said, already backing away like he couldn't leave fast enough. The wood felt warm under my hands, which didn't make sense for something that had been in a delivery truck. That's when I noticed the grain pattern, the distinctive swirl near one corner that looked like an eye watching you. My chest tightened, because I knew that pattern, knew it the way you know your own reflection. "What is that?" Catherine's voice came from behind me, high and sharp, like glass breaking. I hadn't heard her come downstairs, but there she stood in the doorway, her face drained of color like she'd seen a ghost. Maybe she had. "It's just a package," I said, though we both knew it wasn't just anything. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone, fingers fumbling with the screen. "Don't open it," she said, backing away from the box like it might explode. "Can't you see what this is?" I could see exactly what it was. The wood came from the old oak tree that stood in my parents' backyard for over a century, the one my father and I had carved our initials into when I was 7 years old, the one that got cut down last year when the property was sold. Catherine was already dialing someone, her voice dropping to that whisper she thought I couldn't hear. "She did it," she hissed into the phone. "The box is here." "Yes, I'm looking at it right now." She glanced at me, then turned away, cupping the phone closer. I pretended to examine the box while straining to hear every word. The wood felt familiar under my fingers, each groove and grain line telling a story I thought had been buried with that tree. There was something hauntingly familiar in the grain of the wood, as if it carried echoes from long before. "We need to move faster," Catherine whispered into the phone. And that's when I knew. This wasn't just a Father's Day gift. This was something else entirely. She hung up and forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Why don't you leave that for later, honey? Thomas and Kelly are coming for dinner. You should rest." Rest. That's what she always said now, like I was some fragile thing that might break if I stayed awake too long. But I wasn't tired. I was more awake than I'd been in months because that box, that impossible box made from a tree that shouldn't exist anymore, was trying to tell me something. And Catherine, my wife of 38 years, was terrified of what that might be. I carried the box to my study, the one room in the house that still felt like mine, and set it on the desk next to the photo of my father. Catherine hovered in the doorway, wringing her hands the way she did when she was calculating something. "James," she said, using that careful tone people use with children or the confused elderly, "maybe we should call Laura first. She might know who sent it." Laura, our daughter who lived 3,000 miles away and hadn't been home since Christmas. "Maybe," I said, though I had a feeling Laura knew exactly who sent it. In fact, I was starting to think she was the one who sent it. The question was why, and what was inside that had Catherine so scared she looked ready to grab it and throw it in the garbage disposal. That evening, as I sat with the unopened box in my study, my mind drifted back 6 months to the family meeting that should have been my first warning sign. They'd all gathered in the living room on a Sunday afternoon. Thomas and Kelly, even Laura joining by video call on the laptop. Catherine had made coffee, and those little sandwiches she only bothered with when she wanted something. "Dad," Thomas had started, using his lawyer voice, the one that cost $300 an hour. "We need to talk about the house. The house. Not our home, not the place where he'd taken his first steps, or where Laura had hidden under the stairs during thunderstorms. Just the house. Like it was any property listing in the newspaper. Dad doesn't need this big house anymore," Thomas had said, Kelly nodding beside him like one of those dashboard dogs. I looked at my son then, really looked at him. Funny how I'd never noticed he had brown eyes when both Catherine and I had blue, how his jaw was square when mine was round, his height 6'2" when I was 5'9", and Catherine was 5'4". My mother's words from 40 years ago echoed suddenly. "That boy doesn't have your nose, Jamie." I'd laughed it off then. Mothers and their paranoia. "It's too much maintenance, too many stairs. We've found a nice community at Pine Grove, all on one level, with people your age, people my age. Like I was a breed of dog that needed to be kept with its own kind." Catherine had sat there, silent, studying her coffee cup, like it held the secrets of the universe. Not one word of protest, not one mention of the garden we'd built together, or the workshop where I'd made furniture for every room. Laura's face on the screen had been unreadable, but I caught her opening her mouth twice like she wanted to speak, then closing it again. The financial ambush came next, dressed up as concern for my well-being. "We've set up automatic payments for all your bills," Kelly had announced, proud as a teacher's pet. "You won't have to worry about anything." What she didn't mention was that they'd also set up automatic transfers that drained most of my retirement account into a joint account I supposedly agreed to. Funny how I didn't remember signing those papers, but there was my signature, shaky and uncertain, on documents dated during my brief hospital stay for pneumonia last spring. The medication had made me foggy, but not that foggy. Still, try explaining that to a bank manager who's golf buddies with your son. The credit card started declining a month later. "Unusual activity," the customer service rep had said, which apparently meant buying the same groceries I'd bought for 40 years. Catherine had smiled and handed me a prepaid card for emergencies, with a balance that wouldn't cover a real emergency unless the emergency was running out of coffee. The house felt different after that meeting, like the walls were closing in, or maybe pushing me out. My chair at the dinner table, the leather one I'd bought when Thomas was born, mysteriously developed a wobble that couldn't be fixed. "We'll get you a new one," Catherine had promised, but the new one ended up in the garage because it didn't match the set. Then came the photo album incident, which still makes my chest tight when I think about it. Catherine had hired someone to digitize our family photos, a gift, she said, so we could preserve them forever. When the albums came back, I was gone from half the pictures, cropped out or mysteriously blurred. Our wedding photo, the one where I'd lifted her veil and she'd laughed because I'd accidentally stepped on her dress, now showed mostly her with just my elbow visible at the edge. "Must be a scanning error," she'd said, but scanning errors don't selectively edit out one person while leaving everyone else crystal clear. Laura was the only one who still called regularly, always when she knew Catherine would be at her book club, or Thomas at work. "How are you really, Dad?" she'd ask, and something in her voice told me she knew. She'd send text messages that seemed innocent enough, but always had an undertone I couldn't quite place. "Remember the time we built that birdhouse?" she'd written last week. "You said the most important thing was making sure the foundation was solid. We'd never built a birdhouse together, but I understood what she was trying to say. My foundation in this family, in this life I'd built, was rotting from underneath, and she could see it even from 3,000 miles away. The discovery that changed everything came by accident. Or maybe there are no accidents when you're being systematically erased from your own life. I'd been looking for my old tax returns in the filing cabinet, the one Catherine said we didn't need anymore because everything's digital now. Hidden behind a folder of old insurance papers, I found a power of attorney document with my signature, except I'd never signed it. The signature was close, but the J in James was wrong. Too flowery, the way Catherine always thought I should write it, but never did. This document gave Thomas complete control over my assets if I was deemed mentally incapacitated, and according to the attached medical evaluation, I was already showing signs of cognitive decline. Dr. Marshall, who'd been my physician for 20 years, had supposedly written that evaluation. The funny thing was, Dr. Marshall had retired 18 months ago and moved to Florida. I knew because I'd gone to his retirement party, given him the hand-carved chess set I'd made. Whoever wrote that evaluation had never met me, but they'd certainly met my bank accounts. The rage that built in my chest was quiet, cold, the kind that makes you very careful and very deliberate. I photocopied everything, then put the originals back exactly as I'd found them. That night at dinner, I smiled and nodded and let Catherine cut my meat, because the knife wasn't sharp enough, though I'd sharpened it myself that morning. The text from Laura came as I sat in my study, staring at that wooden box. Open it when you're alone. Everything you need is inside. Trust me, Dad. It's time. Catherine left for her sister's house the next morning. A sudden emergency involving a broken water heater that absolutely couldn't wait. I'll be back by dinner, she said, kissing my cheek with lips that felt cold as winter rain. The moment her car turned the corner, I locked the study door and pulled out the wooden box. My hands weren't shaking from age or illness. They were shaking from anticipation. Laura's text had been clear. Everything I needed was inside. The lid opened with a soft click, releasing the smell of old oak and something else, maybe hope, maybe revenge. Inside, cushioned in blue velvet that looked like it came from my mother's old jewelry box, lay a USB drive, a brass key I didn't recognize, and a manila envelope thick with papers. Laura's handwriting covered a single sheet on top. Dad, I've been watching and documenting everything for 2 years. I'm sorry I had to pretend to go along with them. It was the only way to gather proof. Play the USB first, alone, with headphones. The key opens safety deposit box number 473 at First National, the branch on Maple Street. I love you. Your daughter, who remembers everything you taught her about standing up for what's right. The USB slid into my laptop with a quiet click that sounded like a bullet being chambered. 23 audio files appeared on the screen, dated over the past 18 months. I put on my old workshop headphones, the ones I used when running the table saw, and clicked the first file. Thomas's voice filled my ears, clear as if he was sitting next to me. Once he signs the papers, we can put him in Pine Grove facility. They have a memory care unit that costs $8,000 a month, but insurance covers most of it once he's declared incompetent. Kelly's laugh came next, that tittering sound she made when she was nervous. How long do we have to wait after he's in there before we can sell the house? My stomach turned to lead as I listened to my family plan my disposal, like they were arranging a garage sale. File after file revealed the conspiracy in their own words. Catherine's voice in recording number 12 made me grip the desk until my knuckles went white. 20 years I've waited. 20 years of pretending everything was fine while he lived in his perfect little world, with his tools and his garden. I deserve this house, this life. Kevin says once the paperwork goes through, we can be together openly. Kevin. The name meant nothing to me then, but Catherine's tone said everything. There was warmth in her voice I hadn't heard directed at me in years. Recording 15 was the jackpot, a family meeting I didn't even know had happened. They'd gathered at Thomas's house, while I was at my monthly poker game with the guys from the hardware store. The medication is working, Catherine said. He's getting more confused, forgetting conversations. Dr. Charles says another few months and no one will question the diagnosis. Dr. Charles. Kevin Charles. The pieces clicked together like the joints in a handmade cabinet. Just make sure Laura doesn't find out the real plan, Thomas warned. She's already asking too many questions. There was a pause. Then Catherine again. I'll handle Laura. She either plays along or loses access to her son. Simple as that. They were using my grandson, little Marcus, who I'd taught to whittle last summer, as leverage against my own daughter. The rage that built in my chest was cold and patient, the kind that waits for exactly the right moment. I copied every file to 3 different drives, then found the documents in the envelope. Bank statements showing systematic transfers from my accounts, medical forms with forged signatures, and the crown jewel, a contract for the sale of our house to a developer, already signed by Catherine and Thomas as my legal representatives, dated 3 months in the future. They'd already spent money they didn't have yet, counting on my erasure as a done deal. The key felt heavy in my hand as I drove to First National Bank, parking in the back like I was having an affair with the truth. The safety deposit box was registered in my father's name, somehow still active after all these years. Inside were more documents, the real deed to our house, showing it was in a trust my father had set up, not in Catherine's and my name as we'd always believed. Photos of Catherine with a man I now assumed was Kevin Charles, dating back 15 years. They were kissing outside a hotel in photos dated during her supposed book club retreats. And at the bottom, a will. My father's real will. Not the one Thomas had found after Dad died, but one dated a week before his death with a video witness. I sat in that cold bank vault reading my father's words. If my son James is ever betrayed by blood or marriage, all assets revert to his most loyal child. He'd known. Somehow that canny old man had seen what I'd been blind to. There was also a business card for a lawyer named Patricia Smith, with a note in Laura's handwriting. She's expecting your call. She's been retained and paid for 1 year in advance. My daughter had built me an escape route while playing the perfect conspirator, gathering evidence from the inside while they thought she was one of them. The sound of sirens in the distance made me look up from the papers. They were getting closer, and for a wild moment I wondered if Catherine had somehow figured out where I was. But they passed by, heading somewhere else with someone else's emergency. I packed everything back into the box, keeping only the USB and the lawyer's card. As I left the bank, my phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. "Where are you? Kevin's here with papers. And a locksmith." A locksmith. They weren't just planning to steal my money anymore. They were changing the locks on my own house while I was gone. They were waiting in the living room like vultures around roadkill, except the roadkill wasn't quite dead yet. The locksmith's van was still in the driveway. Eddie's 24-hour service painted on the side. New locks gleamed on the front door, brass and aggressive. Catherine had set out the good china, the set we'd gotten for our wedding that she said was too nice for everyday use, now apparently perfect for stealing my life. Kevin Charles sat in my chair, my father's leather wingback that had been in the family for 60 years, holding papers like he owned the place. Maybe in his mind, he already did. His suit probably cost more than I made in a month during my construction days, and his watch caught the light like a warning. Thomas stood by the window, that nervous habit he'd had since childhood when he was about to do something he knew was wrong. Back then it was lying about broken windows or failed tests. Now it was stealing his father's life. "Dad," he said, without looking at me, his voice strange, formal. "This is Kevin, our family lawyer." The lie came so easily to him now, like he'd been practicing. "Your mother's lawyer," I corrected, settling into the uncomfortable guest chair they'd left for me, the wobbly one from the kitchen that Catherine had been meaning to throw away. Amazing how you become a guest in your own home, relegated to the broken furniture while strangers sit in your father's chair. Kevin extended his hand and I shook it, noting the manicured nails and soft palms of a man who'd never built anything real in his life, never felt wood splinter or concrete set. His handshake was weak, the kind my father would have called fish grip. "Mr. James," he started in that condescending tone people use with children and the elderly, like I was both and neither all at once. "We have some documents that need your signature. Just routine updates to your estate planning." I let my hand shake slightly as I reached for the papers, added a confused squint that I'd been practicing in the mirror. The truth was, my eyes were sharp as ever, 20/20 with my reading glasses. "What exactly am I signing?" I asked, letting a small slur creep into my voice, just enough to make them lean forward eagerly. Catherine jumped in, her voice honey-sweet and completely fake, the voice she used with door-to-door salesmen before slamming the door. "It's just updating the power of attorney, darling. Making sure Thomas can help with the bills if you're ever unable to. You remember we discussed this?" We'd never discussed anything. They'd ambushed me, but I nodded slowly, like I was trying to recall a conversation that never happened. The documents were thick, legal-sized pages full of dense text that would have confused anyone without a law degree. But I'd spent years reading contracts, blueprints, specifications. I knew how to spot the traps. Hidden on page 12 was the real poison: immediate transfer of all assets upon mental incapacitation, as determined by any licensed physician. Not my physician, not a team of doctors, just any doctor Kevin could buy. On page 18, permission to sell real estate without my consent. Page 23, the right to admit me to a care facility of their choosing. "Where do I sign?" I asked, letting my voice crack slightly. Thomas and Catherine exchanged glances, little victory smiles they thought I didn't catch. Like when Thomas was 16 and thought he was getting away with taking the car without permission. I'd always known. Just chose my battles. I picked up the pen with deliberately unsteady fingers and started to sign, then stopped. "This doesn't look right," I said, squinting at the signature line. "Is this my name?" The panic in Catherine's eyes was beautiful, but Kevin smoothly intervened, leaning over me, his cologne expensive and suffocating. "Yes, Mr. James, that's where you sign your name. Just like you always do." I nodded slowly, then signed with a shaky hand, deliberately misspelling my middle name and adding an extra loop to the J that made it technically illegible. If they ever tried to use these documents, any decent handwriting expert would flag them as suspicious. "Perfect," Kevin said, snatching the papers away before I could accidentally spill the coffee Catherine had strategically placed within my reach. They thought they'd won, these three conspirators celebrating their successful elder abuse with my wedding china and my father's chair. Thomas actually relaxed enough to pour himself a scotch from my cabinet, the 18-year-old Macallan I'd been saving for his 40th birthday next month. $2,000 a bottle, saved penny by penny over 3 years. He drank it like it was Jack Daniels, no appreciation for what he was destroying. His hands shook slightly, and I noticed the dark circles under his eyes, the weight loss. The golden boy lawyer was falling apart from the inside. "We should celebrate," he said, but his voice was hollow. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment I saw the little boy who used to follow me around the workshop. "Dad, he started, then stopped, drowning whatever he was going to say in expensive scotch. "You should rest. You look tired." Later, Laura would tell me Thomas had called her that night. Drunk, crying, saying he was sorry but he needed the money. "They'll kill me, Laura. Actually kill me. And maybe it's what I deserve. I'm not even his real son." She'd tried to talk him down for 3 hours, all while maintaining her cover. I did look tired because I'd practiced that too, the hollow eyes and confused expression of a man losing his grip on reality. But inside I was coiled like a spring, ready to snap back. What they didn't know was that earlier that morning, before Catherine's conveniently timed emergency, I'd met with Patricia Smith at a coffee shop downtown. She was nothing like Kevin Charles, her handshake firm from years of fighting real battles in courtrooms instead of stealing from old men. Your daughter hired me 18 months ago, she'd said, sliding documents across the table. We've been preparing for this day. Everything had already been transferred into an irrevocable trust with Laura as the executor. The house, the investments, even the tools in my workshop that my grandfather had passed down. All protected. The papers I'd just signed for Kevin were worthless, giving Thomas power over accounts that had been emptied and assets that no longer existed in my name. As I sat there pretending to doze off in the uncomfortable chair, I heard Catherine whisper to Kevin, "How long before we can move him?" Kevin's response was quiet, but clear to my recording app. "Give it another week. We need one more evaluation from Dr. Charles. Then Pine Grove already has a room ready. The deposit's been paid. They'd already picked out my prison cell, paid for it with my own money probably." Thomas added, "I've got a buyer for his tools. Some collector who'll pay $30,000 for the whole workshop." My tools. The ones my grandfather had passed to my father and my father to me. The ones I'd planned to give to Marcus someday. That's when I decided to accelerate my timeline. "I need to use the bathroom," I announced, standing up with calculated unsteadiness. As I passed the entry hall, I quietly unlocked the front door, then sent a text from the bathroom. Now. 5 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Detective Lewis wasn't alone. 2 FBI agents followed him in, their badges catching the afternoon light streaming through the window my mother had insisted face east for morning sun. Catherine's face went from pale to ghostly white, her hand reaching for Kevin's arm before she caught herself. "This must be some mistake," she said, her voice climbing an octave with each word. "My husband is ill. He's been having episodes of confusion." Lewis looked at me, and I saw recognition in his eyes. We'd met before, years ago, when I'd built custom cabinets for his mother's kitchen. "Mr. James," he said carefully, "are you feeling confused right now?" I smiled, dropping the act like a coat that never fit right. "Clear as I've been in 62 years, Detective." The transformation on their faces was worth every minute of pretending to be senile. Thomas actually stepped backward like I'd grown fangs, his scotch sloshing over the rim of my good crystal. Kevin started to speak, that lawyer instinct to control the narrative, but Lewis cut him off. "Mr. Charles, you'll want to remain silent. You're under investigation for fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit false imprisonment." The FBI agents were already photographing documents, bagging the papers I'd just signed as evidence. Catherine found her voice, shrill and desperate. "James, what have you done? This is your family." "Family," I repeated, tasting the word like spoiled milk. "Family doesn't drug their father to fake dementia. Family doesn't steal $700,000 to pay gambling debts." I looked directly at Thomas, who seemed to shrink into himself. "Yes, son, I know about the Golden Dragon Casino, about Big Eddie and his interest rates, about how you promised him the house as collateral." Laura chose that moment to walk through the door I'd unlocked earlier, and the sight of her nearly made me cry. Not on a screen, not 3,000 miles away, but here, my daughter, carrying banker's boxes full of evidence she'd been collecting for 2 years. "Hello, Mom," Laura said coldly to Catherine. "Hi, Thomas. Kevin, we haven't officially met, but I've been recording your calls with Mom for 18 months. She set down the boxes with a satisfying thud on my father's oak table. "Every prescription you had Dr. Charles write for Dad, every forged document, every transfer from his accounts. I have copies of everything." She pulled out a manila folder and handed it to Detective Lewis. "This one's my favorite. Mom's application for a $300,000 loan using Dad's forged signature, dated 2 days after she had Dr. Charles declare him mentally incompetent. Hard to be incompetent and simultaneously capable of complex financial decisions, isn't it?" The best part was watching them turn on each other. Kevin immediately distanced himself from Catherine, literally stepping away from her as he told the agents he was merely providing legal counsel based on information provided by his clients. Catherine spun toward him, her face twisted with rage and betrayal. 15 years, Kevin! 15 years I waited for you! That confession alone was worth gold, but Thomas topped it by blurting out, "This was all Mom's idea. She said Dad would be happier at Pine Grove, that it was for his own good." The FBI agent recording everything actually smirked at that one. Laura pulled out her phone and showed Detective Lewis something that made him nod grimly. "We also have evidence of medical fraud," she announced. "Dr. Charles, who's been writing prescriptions for my father, lost his license in Nevada 3 years ago for overprescribing opioids. He's not legally allowed to practice medicine anywhere in the United States." Kevin's face went from pale to green. Apparently, his girlfriend's brother wasn't quite the upstanding physician he'd pretended to be. "Additionally," Laura continued, methodical as a prosecutor, "the Pine Grove facility they planned to put Dad in, it's being investigated for Medicare fraud and patient abuse. 23 deaths in the last 2 years, all ruled natural causes despite families' complaints." I walked to my workshop door, running my hand along the frame I'd carved with roses for Catherine on our 10th anniversary. "You know what the funny thing is?" I said to no one in particular. "I would have given you everything. If you'd just asked. If you'd been honest about needing money, about wanting different lives. But you had to try to erase me, make me into nothing, steal not just my money, but my mind, my dignity, my place in this family." I picked up the small wooden box Laura had made in high school woodshop, the one where she'd carved "World's Best Dad" with more love than skill. "This is worth more to me than everything you tried to steal." Detective Lewis cleared his throat professionally. "Mrs. James, Mr. James Jr., Mr. Charles, you'll need to come with us for formal questioning. You have the right to remain silent." As he read them their rights, I noticed Catherine staring at the family portrait above the fireplace, the one where we all looked so happy. Thomas was crying now, not the tears of remorse, but the tears of someone who'd gambled everything and lost. Kevin had already pulled out his phone, probably calling his own lawyer. The FBI agents escorted them out one by one, neighbors gathering on their lawns to watch the drama unfold. Mrs. Patterson from next door actually applauded, which told me she'd known something was wrong all along. Laura and I stood in the suddenly quiet house, surrounded by evidence boxes and the ghost of what had been a family. "I'm sorry I had to pretend to go along with them," she said, her voice breaking for the first time. "When I figured out what they were doing, I knew they'd just hide it better if I confronted them. So I became their inside supporter, encouraging their plans while documenting everything." I pulled my daughter into a hug, the first real one we'd had in 2 years. "You saved me," I whispered into her hair that still smelled like the strawberry shampoo she'd used since high school. "No, Dad," she whispered back. "You taught me to save you. Remember what you always said? If someone shows you who they are, believe them and protect yourself accordingly." The doorbell rang again, and this time it was Patricia Smith with more documents. "Mr. James, I need you to sign these, your real signature this time. This formally transfers all assets into the trust and names Laura as executor. Also, there's the matter of your father's will." She pulled out a document that made my hands shake for real this time. "According to this codicil, if any family member attempts to harm or defraud you, their inheritance is automatically redistributed to charity, specifically the Elder Abuse Prevention Foundation your father established shortly before his death." "Thomas isn't your son," she said, the words falling like stones into still water. Her hands trembled as she picked at a loose thread on her designer jeans, unable to meet my eyes. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, highlighting the gray in her hair she'd stopped dyeing months ago, as if maintaining the lie of youth was too much alongside all her other deceptions. I kept planting, though my hands stilled for just a moment. "I know," I replied, which made her gasp. "I've known for about 10 years, ever since he needed that blood transfusion after the car accident. Type O negative can't come from 2 type A positive parents." I noticed then that her wedding ring was gone, just a pale band of skin where it used to be. She'd been preparing for this moment longer than I'd realized. You knew? All this time? Her voice broke completely. Why didn't you say anything? Why did you let me carry this poison alone? Because I loved him, I said simply. Because being his father had nothing to do with DNA, and everything to do with teaching him to ride a bike, staying up when he had nightmares, watching him graduate. You think I cared about blood? I cared about love, until you taught him that blood was all that mattered. My mother had warned me 40 years ago, the day before our wedding. She'd pulled me aside in the church vestibule, gripped my hands with her arthritis-gnarled fingers, and said, "That girl has secrets, Jamie. I see it in how she looks past you when she thinks you're not watching. And that baby came awful quick after the wedding. I'd laughed it off then, thought Mom was being overprotective, old-fashioned. She died thinking I never knew. But mothers always know. She'd seen Thomas grow up looking nothing like me, and everything like Catherine's college boyfriend who died in that car accident. What was I supposed to say? I asked Catherine. That I'd figured out my wife had an affair? That the son I'd raised wasn't mine by blood, but was mine in every way that mattered? I chose to keep loving him because that's what fathers do. She started crying then, not the pretty tears she'd perfected for manipulation, but raw, ugly sobs that shook her whole body. The sound echoed off the garden walls like an accusation. He died, she choked out. Thomas's real father. Car accident when Thomas was 2. I wanted to tell you, but then years passed, and it became this massive lie I couldn't undo. Her shoulders hunched forward, as if the weight of 40 years was finally crushing her. When Thomas found out 5 years ago through that DNA test Kelly bought him, he was devastated. Said I'd made his whole life a lie. The gambling started right after. He was so angry, so lost. And your solution was to steal from me and lock me away? I asked, genuinely curious about the logic. Catherine wiped her nose with a tissue, her hand shaking so badly she could barely hold it. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 4 times, each note hanging in the air like a judgment. Kevin said if you were declared incompetent, Thomas could claim his inheritance as your recognized son. DNA wouldn't matter legally, and then Kevin and I could finally be together without scandal. She looked at the garden gate, avoiding my eyes. 20 years I've been waiting, James. 20 years of sneaking around. Actually, it's been 15 years, I corrected. I have the hotel receipts. The precision of the correction seemed to break something in her. Her face crumpled like old paper. You had me investigated? I laughed, really laughed. No, Catherine. Laura had you investigated. She knew something was wrong when you started pushing for power of attorney. Catherine stood up, brushing dirt from her jeans with movements that seemed mechanical, rehearsed. Thomas needs help, James. Real help. The people he owes money to won't care that he's in jail. I nodded, having already thought about this. Patricia Smith has arranged for Thomas's debts to be paid from the trust, conditional on him completing rehab and cutting all ties with you and Kevin. It's not for him, it's for Marcus. At the mention of our grandson, real pain flashed across her face, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her in years. Can I still see him? She whispered. That's up to Kelly and Laura, I said, patting soil around the last tomato plant. But Catherine, you need to understand something. You're not the victim here. You betrayed the man who loved your son without question, who taught him to ride a bike and paid for his education. You betrayed the grandfather who was planning to leave everything to his children anyway. She turned to leave, then stopped at the garden gate. For what it's worth, James, I did love you once. Before Kevin, before the lies got so heavy I couldn't breathe. I know, I said. That's what makes this so sad. Check the news, Catherine. Kevin gave an interview this morning claiming you manipulated him. Her strangled cry when she pulled out her phone told me everything. He wouldn't... 15 years. I turned back to my garden. People show you who they are, Catherine. Kevin's showing you now. That night, Laura and I went through photo albums, the real ones I'd hidden in the workshop. This one. Laura pointed to a picture of Thomas at 8, holding up a fish we'd caught. This is who he was before. Look how he's looking at you, Dad. Like you hung the moon. I traced the photo with one finger, remembering that day, how Thomas had insisted on throwing the fish back because it probably has a family. That little boy was gone now, but in my memory, he'd always exist, pure and untainted by the truth that destroyed him. Do you regret not telling him? Laura asked. No, I said finally. The biology was never the lie. The lie was your mother letting him believe I would have loved him less. I wouldn't have. He was my son until he chose to stop being my son. The will reading happened on a Tuesday, 6 months after the arrests, in Patricia Smith's office with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Thomas was there on supervised release, ankle monitor visible under his too short pants. He'd lost weight in jail, his expensive suit hanging loose like a costume he no longer knew how to wear. Catherine sat across from him, careful not to make eye contact with anyone. Kevin Charles was notably absent, having fled to Canada after losing his license and facing federal charges. Laura sat beside me, her hand occasionally touching my arm like she needed to make sure I was still there, still solid. Patricia cleared her throat and opened the sealed envelope that had been in the safety deposit box. This is the last will and testament of James Sr., grandfather to Laura and Thomas Jr., executed 1 week before his death with video witnesses and a cognitive evaluation to prevent any challenges. She looked pointedly at Catherine and Thomas. He was quite specific about wanting to avoid any questions about his mental state. My father, sharp until the end, planning for betrayals he'd seen coming that I'd been blind to. To my son James, Patricia read, I leave the complete ownership of the family property, all tools and equipment in the workshop, and the contents of safety deposit box 473 at First National Bank, which you've already discovered. The wooden box was my way of making sure you'd find it when you needed it most. Sometimes we can't see the forest for the trees, son, but the trees remember everything. I smiled despite the tears threatening. My father and his metaphors, his wooden box made from the very tree we'd planted together, holding the keys to my salvation. Additionally, Patricia continued, I've established a trust fund for my great-grandchildren's education, managed by my granddaughter Laura, who showed the wisdom to see truth when others chose blindness. To Thomas Jr., I leave the brass compass from my desk, so he might find his way back to true north. To Catherine, I leave nothing, as she's already taken more than her share. Catherine made a sound like she'd been slapped. Thomas stared at the compass Patricia pulled from a box, the one Grandpa had carried in the Navy, the one Thomas had played with as a child. However, Patricia said, and everyone leaned forward, there is a provision. If James chooses to forgive and provide for those who wronged him, the trust allows for his discretion. The choice, James, is entirely yours. All eyes turned to me, waiting to see if I'd be the bigger man, the forgiving father, the understanding husband. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city my father had helped build with his construction company, where I'd learned to measure twice and cut once, to build things that last. Thomas, I said, not turning around, you'll receive a monthly allowance that covers basic living expenses for 5 years, contingent on staying in therapy and remaining gambling-free. 1 slip, 1 bet, and it's over. Kelly and Marcus will continue to have access to the education trust. You're still Marcus's father, and he needs you whole, not broken by addiction and debt. Thomas made a sound that might have been, thank you, or might have been a sob. I didn't look to see which. Catherine, I continued, the house will be sold. You'll receive 20% of the sale price, enough to start over somewhere else. The divorce papers Patricia has drawn up are non-negotiable. You get this one payment and nothing more. No alimony, no continued support. 20% for 38 years. That seems more than fair. She didn't respond, but I heard the scratch of a pen on paper. She was signing, finally accepting the consequences of her choices. Laura stood up and joined me at the window. What about you, Dad? What will you do? I pulled out the small velvet bag from my pocket, the one from the wooden box. Inside were acorns from the oak tree, preserved and waiting. I'm going to build a smaller house on the back portion of the property, keep the workshop, and plant new trees. Your grandfather included architectural plans in the safety deposit box, drawn up 40 years ago. He called it the retirement cottage, for when family becomes complicated. We both laughed at that, my prophetic father who'd seen everything coming. The meeting ended with papers signed and uncomfortable goodbyes. Thomas tried to shake my hand, but I couldn't bring myself to take it. Not yet. Maybe someday, but not yet. Catherine left without a word, her heels clicking on the marble floor like a countdown to the end of an era. Laura and I drove home in comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need filling with words. We stopped at the nursery and bought potting soil and containers for the acorns, preparing to grow new trees from old roots. That evening, as Laura helped me plant the acorns in the greenhouse my father had built, she asked, "Do you regret any of it? The marriage? Raising Thomas? The years you spent not knowing?" I thought about it while carefully placing each acorn at the right depth. Not too shallow, not too deep. Regret is for people who wish they'd made different choices. I made the choices I made with the information I had. I loved fully, raised children well, built a life worth stealing. That they tried to steal it doesn't diminish what I built. We worked in companionable silence until all 12 acorns were planted. 12 new trees from one old oak, a legacy that couldn't be forged or stolen. "You know," Laura said, washing the dirt from her hands at the old utility sink, "Mom and Thomas thought they were taking everything from you, but they actually gave you something." I raised an eyebrow, curious. "They gave you freedom, Dad. Freedom from pretending everything was fine, from carrying their secrets, from being responsible for their happiness. You're free now." 6 months later, I stood in the frame of my new house, watching the sunrise paint the sky the color of hope. Just 2 bedrooms and a workshop, but every nail driven with my own hands, every board cut to my specifications. No lies built into these walls, no betrayal hiding in the foundation. The morning sun filtered through sawdust as Marcus helped me sand a piece of oak for a new bookshelf, his small hands wrapped around the sanding block just like I'd taught him. "Grandpa," he said, looking up with Thomas's eyes, but none of his deception, "Mom says Dad is getting better. He's in a place where they help people who make bad bets." I nodded, guiding his strokes along the grain, teaching him what my grandfather had taught me. Respect the wood. Work with it, not against it. Sometimes people lose their way, buddy. The important thing is finding it again. Laura watched from the doorway, coffee in hand, smiling at the scene that reminded me of teaching her these same skills 30 years ago. The acorns had sprouted, 12 small oak trees reaching toward the sun in the greenhouse my father had built in 1978. Marcus had helped plant them, his 7-year-old hands patting dirt with the same care I'd once seen in Thomas at that age. Before the lies, before the gambling, before he learned he wasn't my blood. "Why 12 trees, Grandpa?" he'd asked, his curiosity genuine, untainted. "One for each month of the year," I'd told him, though really it was one for each year I'd truly been happy in that house, before everything went wrong. Laura had brought her woodworking tools, the ones I'd given her for her 16th birthday, and together we'd carved Marcus's initials into a small wooden marker for the strongest sapling. "This one will be yours someday," I told him, "but you have to earn it by taking care of it." He nodded solemnly, understanding even at 7 that some things are worth protecting. Thomas had sent a letter through Patricia Smith, 6 pages of apology I'd read once and filed away. Catherine had moved to Oregon with her 20%, enough to start over, but not enough to forget. The wooden box sits on my mantel now, holding photos worth keeping, the real ones where love wasn't performance. Sometimes I run my fingers over the wood grain, feeling the stories locked in the rings of that old oak. "Trees remember everything," my father had said. They remember the storms, the droughts, the seasons. But most of all, they remember how to grow toward the light. That afternoon, while Marcus napped and Laura worked on her laptop, I sat on my porch and thought about forgiveness. Not the cheap kind that pretends nothing happened, but the real kind that acknowledges the wound while choosing to heal anyway. I thought about Thomas, sitting in rehab, fighting demons I'd never known existed. About Catherine, alone in Oregon with her 20%, and her regrets. About myself, 62 years old, starting over with less money but more truth than I'd had in decades. The acorn doesn't fall far from the tree, they say, but sometimes it rolls just far enough to find better soil. Thank you for taking the time to listen to an old man's story. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more stories, please consider subscribing.